Hello everyone. This is the final part of my interview with former Scientologist and ex-Sea Org member Robyn Capella. This week, we wrap it up with more details about what it's like being not only a staff member for the Church of Scientology, but what it's actually like working for the Office of Special Affairs, the legal and investigative arm of Scientology. In our last episode, Robyn detailed what it was like working with Scientology lawyers on a civil suit, and she now talks about what happened after that case, and what further work she was assigned as the Director of Special Affairs for Scientology in Mountain View, California. This work involved stalking, media monitoring, and work on another court case in the San Jose area, and some other very surprising things, which we talk about in this video. One thing that Robyn brings up, which I want to stress, is this. The Church of Scientology absolutely cannot stand bad press. L. Ron Hubbard's policies call for a sort of rabid dog attack whenever this happens, with the effort being to not just shut up the source of the bad press, but exact a sort of vengeance upon them so that they will never, ever speak about Scientology again. However, that sort of thing only worked in the pre-internet era, when information could be controlled and free speech much more easily squelched. Such is not the case anymore, and so we have now seen story after story come out blowing the lid on Scientology's dirty deeds and corrupt underbelly. It's not a pretty picture, but now that the genie is out of the bottle, it's never going back in again. Many critics and ex-members have done some really championship work on this. On my YouTube channel, I've worked hard to expose how Scientology actually operates versus what their specious public relations stories claim they're doing. When discussing the greed, corruption, physical abuses, and human rights violations that go on in this group, we're talking predominantly about the upper levels of Scientology, its management and leader, David Miscavige, more so than what your day-to-day public Scientologists experience. Unfortunately, the mind control that goes on in this group is very strong. This is so much the case that those day-to-day members are under the horribly mistaken impression that if they listen to or read anything negative about their church, they won't achieve total spiritual freedom and immortality through Scientology. So they keep their eyes and ears squeezed tightly shut and put their heads in the sand. This is why we have to keep exposing the truth about Scientology over and over again and again. And as you'll hear in this video, some of these lower level staff and public have hands that are just as dirty as the Sea Org members at the upper levels. Eventually, all of them will be reached with enough truth from enough people that it will be undeniable to all but the most deaf, dumb, and blind Scientologists. We already know that Scientology is shrinking, and that the truth we're shouting from the rooftops is seeping into the Scientology bubble world on many fronts. Their walls don't just have a few holes in them, they're actually falling down. It's no longer a question of is Scientology going to collapse, but merely a question of when. The more of us who can get through to those still in, the faster this will go. So without further ado, here is part 6.
So you went back to Mountain View after that?
Yep, so then I went back to Mountain View and resumed my duties as the DSA. Yeah.
And how long was it after that that this infamous Keith Henson comes across your radar? And who is Keith Henson?
Well, Keith Henson was always on the radar when I was there because he had, from day one. Henson had been active on the internet in the early days against Scientology on a Usenet group, a forum called Alt Religion Scientology. And he got interested because of the church's actions to squelch free speech. Helena Coburn had tried to delete the Usenet group at one point because it was a nuisance to the church. The church considered it a nuisance, and all these people were saying bad things about it. And one thing that the church could not handle was anybody saying anything bad about it. They would lose their minds, and it made our lives as DSAs hell. It really did. It was just, we would get so much pressure from OSA, the upper levels of OSA, to deal with. We had to, handle deal with this, handle it, however we could. And the pressure was pretty intense, and it was insane how how much attention was being put on this. And unfortunately, it's completely backfired on the church, because the more attention the church put on it and the more efforts to squelch free speech, the more people started paying attention to it and getting involved. And that is actually how Henson got involved to begin with. He's not a former Scientologist. He was never involved.
Oh, so Henson was not out there proactively trying to take the church down. He sees, kind of like years later Anonymous would, when the church was trying to take down the Tom Cruise video, and then they got involved.
Yeah, that's
so
exactly.
This is sort of a precursor to that.
Yeah, absolutely it was. And he would pick at the church. The church sued him for copyright infringement, because one of the things that he did was posted some pages of OT material. And so...
Okay. Which he must have gotten from public domain from the 1980s court case.
Right, yeah, there were, those were kind of around, I guess it was called the Fishman document. It had, OT materials in it, and so he posted a couple of these pages, and the church immediately sued him. And that's when he got even more involved and picketed, and that was already happening when I went up to Mountain View. That had already started.
Right, so all this is backstory to you arriving on the scene.
Right. So what I mainly, the beginning, mostly what I did with Henson was, if he was picketing, and he mostly picketed at the San Jose church because it was a little bigger, I would go down there and help the DSA deal with him. I was often down in San Jose working with the DSA there, and I would go out there and talk to him, and that was basically it. Just to keep him distracted from talking with any of the staff or public or new people or anybody else. And
when you went out there and talked to him, did he ever throw OT material at you, or try to, what did he say?
Not really. I think he said something about Xenu. I didn't really pay attention to any of that, and I'm pretty sure I told him, to please respect my religious beliefs or something like that. He would just, say stuff, and I would just counter, and it was really more both of us just being snarky to each other.
Okay.
At one point,
but the main reason you were there, and you knew the main reason you were there to talk to him, was a distraction so that he wouldn't talk to anybody else.
Right, and also
so you weren't compelled to actually engage in real conversation with the guy, or feel like you had to listen to anything he had to say.
Right, and also to look for any sign of anything that we could contact the police about, like if he stepped over onto church property, if he was aggressive, or any of the picketers that came, did anything, because our bosses up in OSA really, really, really wanted to get restraining orders against these people who would come and picket. And so they would ask us to look for any sign of anything that we could do that with. Really, the converse was happening. The protesters never did any of that. If they went onto church property, it was accidental, and they were quick to comply to get off of church property, obviously. And the church in San Jose, what they would do was turn the sprinkler heads. They turned the sprinkler heads so they would spray onto the sidewalks. And at that time, the picketers were coming at pretty regular intervals, so they would automatically have the sprinklers turn on when the picketers were there. And I recall Henson saying, yes, that, that's what you're doing, and we flat out denied it, even though it was absolutely the case. They actually called the police. It was Henson and I think one or two other people saying that because we had turned on the sprinklers. So the police actually came down, and I was very nice to the police officer, and I definitely said, no, we didn't do that. And and Henson was very agitated, and so the police took our side, and they left. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how many picketers were there, average, or you mentioned picketers?
Yeah. It was sometimes it was just Henson, and sometimes there were a few other people who would come and picket. I think the most we ever had at any time was like 4. It was, there at that order.
Okay. Did they have the thing in where, at the time, they've done this since with the church, but at the time, did they have the thing about cover all the windows and have the public go through an alternate route so they don't even see the picketers and this sort of thing?
No, they didn't have that at the time. It was just, you know, people were told to ignore them and not engage them in any conversation, and that was it. Yeah.
All right, and then you were the one who went out to be the stopgap. You were one of the other DSAs. Did you know what to do based on what Darlene told you to do, or did you actually have to go read the laws on the subject?
No, I just kind of had to wing it.
Okay. A wing and a prayer, all right.
Pretty much, yeah.
Go out there and make it go right. Deal with the picketer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had no problem doing it. I really had no problem talking to these people. Like I said, they weren't, spewing vile invective at me or anything like that. And, one time that I remember, very clearly at Mountain View, one of the things I did at Mountain View was I liked to do these sort of little PR charity projects. And from the church's viewpoint, these were literally just for public relations. But I personally really liked doing them, and they were like toy drives and coat drives and things like that. And those were great. I loved doing that. And probably because it was the one thing I was actually doing that was helping people.
Well, exactly. Oh, wow. Actually doing something for the community, something new and different for the Church of Scientology.
Well, the story around that was I was taking some toys out to my car one time from one of these toy drives, and some of the regular picketers at Mountain View engaged me in a conversation about it, and they were had some weird, thing about exchange. They had read about what Scientology considers the concept of exchange, which means getting something in exchange for what you do. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that helped kind of reinforce that these guys don't know what Scientology is about is that they had misinterpreted it to mean you couldn't give a kid a toy without violating the conditions of exchange. And
right. So this just comes across as totally ridiculous to you.
Yeah. Oh, complete nonsense. And I mean, they knew that the toy drive was all just PR and the church didn't actually care. And I knew that, but I cared and I liked it and I wanted to do it, and so that's why I did it. It was actually the only really good press I ever got in Scientology was doing these things, and that was very easy, to get
surprise there. Not that hard to do when you actually care.
Yeah.
Now here's a question I've also been asked. Just occurred to me to ask you this.
Sure.
What was there anything that those picketers could have actually said to you where your head was at the time that would have gotten you going, oh, wow, maybe what I'm doing isn't really the right thing to be doing?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, actually. And at various times I've come up with some things, because what they would do and what they would talk about never did. In fact, I talked to a former Scientologist who I had known a little in LA who was suddenly picketing, and she said to me, "Aren't you tired of being responsible?" And I wasn't tired of being responsible, you see. So to me, that just meant, oh, she was just being irresponsible, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were plenty of, in the whole thing about Scientology kills, while literally true, was something that no Scientologist would ever believe.
Right.
So it just was massive hyperbole to them, and even to many back at the time. Now I think more people would believe it to be true, but back at the time it seemed more like, well, that seems extreme. If they really did kill people, they wouldn't be able to see they're operating, and look at how nice they seem, and
Well, exactly, and this is right before Lisa McPherson happens, and so what? Scientology kills who? What are you talking about?
Yeah. It was actually right around that time, but that was not widely known news outside of Scientology. And
that's
what we were actually
that's what I'm saying. It's literally happening right then. You don't know anything about that. Lisa McPherson is not being talked about by anybody anywhere in Scientology. Right. All right, so now let's talk about Keith Henson. Let's get back to that.
Yes.
Now, how did Keith Henson escalate from he's running around picketing to now we're in court, there's a copyright infringement case, and what was your activity with that?
Right. Well, like I said, the case itself had already been filed when I when I was the DSA. It had already started, ongoing. But it was, all of the pre-trial stuff. And one of the things that I had to do was, for some reason, there was a lot of, anxiousness and anxiety and paranoia about Henson going down to Los Angeles to picket at international events that David Miscavige was going to be speaking at. And so anytime one of these would occur, I would be ordered by my seniors at the Office of Special Affairs for the West US to go to his house and stake it out.
You had to go stake out Keith Henson's
house.
The event was happening in Los Angeles.
Yeah, prior to the event, so that they would know, so I could tell them if his car was there, because I knew where he lived, what kind of car he drove, and I was told that if he left, I would have to follow him to see if he was going to the airport.
Did he ever leave while you were staking him out?
Yes, he did one time, and I tried to follow him.
You tailed him.
I did. I tried to. It was really nerve-wracking. My heart was racing. I didn't want to be doing it. I hated going on these stakeouts. Not only was it incredibly boring, I felt just yucky about the whole thing. It was just, Henson was harmless. He honestly was. He was completely harmless. He was just this guy, and they were making this huge deal about this guy, and I didn't understand it at all. He was not difficult to deal with.
So was there fear of him going and disrupting an event in Los Angeles that Miscavige was at? Had he ever gone to Los Angeles and done anything like that?
I think he had picketed at events down there, but there wasn't any more disruption than that.
Okay.
He'd never had any history of going into one of the churches and being disruptive or anything like that. He would just stay outside and picket and sometimes say something snarky and, be his snarky self. And it really didn't go beyond that I ever saw. And I dealt with him a lot. And so I honestly, even at the time, I didn't understand the paranoia, but I had to do it. It was considered very, very important. And at one time, I was told I needed to find out if he, his flight plan. They heard or had some idea that he was flying, my bosses at OSA, and I had to call his house and pretend to be from the airline to try and find out his flight data. And I don't know that I'd ever been so nervous in my life as that moment, and I never did it again. It was so awful. It was awful. I talked to him. I don't remember what came of it. I don't think anything. I have no idea if he knew. Nothing.
Well, he and at this point in time, he had spoken with you in person.
This maybe, yeah. I mean, this was pretty early on. I may not have, this was pretty early on, so maybe, but yeah.
Got it. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So, were there other people besides Keith Henson that this was occurring with during your time?
But not that I had to personally deal with. He was the biggest in my, vicinity. I know that the DSA for San Jose, I know that she had to do the same thing with certain individuals, and I know that she'd actually done something that was called euphemistic. It was called the D line. And what the D line was, I think it probably stood for dumpster line, and that was going through people's trash. Was that what that was?
The
called?
D line.
The D line.
That's what they call it.
That's what they call it. Yeah, they call it the D line.
And this is literally putting on rubber gloves, picking up somebody's trash, and going through it.
Yep, and I know that she had to do that at one point. I never did. I never got asked to do it. I really am glad that never happened, because I really never would have wanted to do that. One thing that also was occurring was what the church called counter pickets. Scientologists, DSAs were being ordered to have local Scientologists go to the homes of these protesters and picket their homes and put up flyers around their houses and places, and actually
put flyers around their houses?
Yeah, put up flyers on like telephone poles or in laundromats or wherever that were, those nasty, like websites that they put up now. They had flyers. Yeah.
This is pre-internet black PR techniques.
Right. Yeah.
And
yeah.
were you told what to put on the flyers, or was it sort of make it up?
Flyers. I was sent the flyers. The flyers were sent to me from OSA.
Really?
Yes, they were sent to me with the pictures and everything, and about how, you know, it would be a picture of one of these guys, and it would say anti-religious bigot, you know, things like that. And these would be sent to me from OSA. Yeah, and we had pictures of all of these guys, and we had a book at one point of the, you know, the bad guys, and we had to start, you know, showing people at reception these pictures and getting them to learn who they were, so that if they came in, I would be alerted.
I think they call those rogues galleries.
Rogues galleries, that's right. Yes, yes. And Bob Adams actually lived in the area at the time in Palo Alto, and where Keith Henson lived, and he would go over to Henson's house and picket him. Do you know who Bob Adams is?
Yeah, he's like now.
I think he might currently be, or he was recently, the spokesperson for the church for a little while. He's a former football player.
Right.
Yeah, in the Sea Org now. Yeah, OT8. Yep. He would go and do that. Yep.
When you were putting up those flyers and whatnot, did it ever occur to you that what you were doing was in any way wrong?
I never put up the flyers. I didn't do that.
Oh, you gave them to other people to give out.
I was told to give them to other people. I didn't really do that.
Okay.
I didn't like it. I didn't think it was above a good thing to do. So I just kind of didn't do it.
When it came to the actual court trial, were you involved in that?
You know, that was very sensitive because it was being handled directly by RTC, and Warren McShane was overseeing it, and so he was in town a lot. And so they were really careful about who was involved. Things that I did included, at one point, there was some OT material that was unsealed by the court in the records, in the documents. And we had to go to the courthouse, this has been done before, and sort of babysit those documents, check them out from the clerk, sit with them all day long so that nobody else could get them until they got sealed. So I did that for days and days on end.
Oh, you did?
I did, yeah. I read everything else in the file but that section. I knew exactly where that section was, yeah.
Okay. So you were never tempted to open them up and read them?
Oh, of course not, because I wasn't going to.
No,
you know,
of course not.
I mean, having been, you know, where I was, I got very adept at seeing where to stop reading because I didn't want to, you know, risk my future progress of going up the bridge, right?
Exactly. I totally understand that.
Yeah.
Had that thought process. So how was it that Keith ended up losing this case? What can you say about that?
Okay, so I was in the courtroom every day for trial, and one of the things that I have to say about Keith is that he was a pretty eccentric guy. I think this is pretty well known, and he had been involved in the early days of cryogenics, and he would talk about things that I think the general public would consider pretty morbid, and he would talk about it sort of openly and gleefully and laugh about it. And one of the things that happened was he had written this poem about a guy he knew who had passed away and had wanted his head to be frozen cryogenically so that it could be revived later. And the head got lost, and the FBI or CIA was somehow involved in trying to see if it was a murder case or whatnot. And he had written this poem about this missing head, and it was it was a morbid thing. And the church's attorney got him to talk about that on the stand and recite the poem, which Keith did to much to his delight, because that was his sense of humor. But it was clearly not the jury's sense of humor. I was watching them closely because I had read the poem, and I couldn't believe that he was doing this because he was going to make himself look crazy to these people. And he did, and their reactions were really negative to this. And I think that helped bias their minds against him. I think his
again, we're talking legal strategy, bias the jury by any means possible. Right. This guy's poem has nothing whatsoever to do with the case.
I couldn't believe that the attorney on his side allowed it. He could have easily objected to it. It should have been overruled, or it should have been it shouldn't have happened. It should have been objected to. That would have been sustained as completely irrelevant. And I'm not saying that lost him the case. I'm saying that helped bias the jury against him because, it's a particular type of humor, and it was really clear that a lot of these people didn't share that and thought it was really morbid and disgusting. So that was one of the anecdotes from the trial. But he lost the case. He was found guilty of infringing on the church's copyrights, and he was ordered to pay $75,000. And immediately there was another case with another person who had posted documents that was bigger. It was a much bigger volume. And so that person immediately settled with RTC for that case. So the church
because they had now established a precedent.
Yeah. So he figured the best option would be to just settle and try and move on with his life. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is back in the day when the church was still taking cases to court proactively,
right?
And we're not afraid of being counter-deposed or, having Miscavige called into a courtroom or something like that.
Oh no, they were very opposed to that. They did not want Miscavige to have to get deposed. They didn't want him.
No, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that anybody ever wanted Miscavige deposed. I'm just saying that the church was willing to go to bat for their copyrights, which is something they're not doing now.
Right. Yeah, it's cat is part too much out of the bag now on the internet.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so then, that was your sort of court experience and whatnot. Right. Now, did you have other experiences with Henson or others that involved? I think you mentioned something one time where Miscavige was going to be deposed locally.
Right. Yeah. Miscavige had to come up for some sort of proceeding. I don't know if it was a deposition or what. We weren't really told. He just had to come up, and all of the DSAs in the area were brought into the courthouse area to do surveillance and make sure none of these Henson or any of these other people who would protest would come to bother him. And so we were kind of set up in strategic positions around the courthouse all day, looking out for these guys, and we all knew who they were. And
how were you in touch with each other by walkie-talkies or?
No,
just at an outpost watching.
We just had to, be there. And I recall when I saw Miscavige coming up the stairs, and Mike Rinder was walking next to him, and I had met Rinder many years previously when I worked at the LRH Life exhibition in Los Angeles. And, he had, he was very different. His demeanor was completely different. He was very pale and looked very much not like himself, like his, sort of jovial, joking self that he was back at that time. And I remember seeing that and being quite shocked and, concerned for him. And I didn't know what was going on. But he was walking right there with Miscavige. And this was, I think, probably around 1999 period. And so now I know, and I was right to be concerned for him. But yeah, I remember that really struck me because here was the commanding officer for OSA International. He may even have been at the time even higher than that, the Watchdog Committee, which was an even higher position. And I couldn't believe how cowed he looked. Yeah. Interesting.
Very interesting. And then, okay, so that, again, another kind of drill called for the DSAs because, they're just random workforce for whatever's needed when it comes to OSA work.
Whatever is needed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other DSAs in the area would always get called onto various projects back and forth. So, yeah, it wasn't just me. It was everybody. Every DSA I knew had at one point been called for some project or other. So.
Well, it was quite interesting to me many years later, since we're just on this one topic real quickly, seeing Mark Warlick, the DSA Los Gatos, was one of the squirrel busters.
Yeah, I saw that, and I was quite surprised because at the very same time the church was saying that they had nothing to do with this. These were individual Scientologists going out there doing this, but there is no way, there is a 0% chance that a DSA would go to another state and picket or do whatever it was. They were doing the squirrel busting things, wearing the weird cameras and confronting, a former Sea Org member like that. There's no chance. It's not even a small chance that they would do that on his own. There's no chance. That was ordered. He was told to do that. And I was actually really quite surprised that they were using a DSA for that. I was like, well, that seems pretty obvious. And then, so,
I was boggled when I saw
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
of course, John Allender is from San Jose.
Yeah.
So, he's the guy who was actually standing at the door confronting Marty Rathman with the webcam on his head, going, hey, Marty, where's your peace folders? And doing all this. And at the bottom of the stairs of those four guys who were there confronting Marty, the guy at the bottom of the stairs with all the big camera equipment, that's Mark Warwick.
Yeah.
And I recognized him right away. I'm like, that's the DSA Los Gatos.
Immediately. He had been DSA for a long time.
Years and years.
And it was amazing how, it was amazing to see the progression of what we did back in the late 90s to what the DSAs were doing then. Because like I said, the thing with the posters that we were supposed to get put around and hand out was bad enough. I mean, that was pretty awful. But this was a whole new level of it,
Yeah, really, really nasty stuff. And
really.
And of course, broadcast all over the world.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
now there was a point also when you were the DSA where there was the Scientology online campaign.
Right.
Okay, what can you tell about that? Because that was kind of a big deal when it happened in the church. Right.
And this was in 1998. And the concept behind it was to sort of create on the internet, recreate the successful I Am a Scientologist ad campaign, which was showing that Scientologists are in every walk of life, could be your next door neighbor, and they're real people. But the way it was implemented was they wanted Scientologists to create all these web pages, with saying who they were and their successes, and they needed it to be done in a very rigid format so people wouldn't go off, and talk about stuff the church didn't want them to talk about. It had to be done very controlled because Scientologists were not supposed to be on the internet talking about Scientology at all.
It was quite a bizarre program that way because of exactly what you just said.
Right, and every page had to be approved so that we would, so that the church would know what people were talking about and would, say, oh, you can't say that or you can't say this. It was very, very controlled. One thing that I was not told, because this was done through the DSA networks, this was sent to us, and we were supposed to get our local Scientologists to do this. So we would give them the software, CDs or discs or whatever it was at the time, and have them put that on their computer to create the web page, right? And instead of just having them go to, at the time, it would have been like GeoCities or one of these things where you could easily create a website, at the time, very, very easily. And millions and millions of people did, but they couldn't trust Scientologists to do that. And also, they had an ulterior motive that I did not know of, was not told about at all. And that was the Net Nanny program that was put onto computers when the Scientologists put the software, install the software. And even though I guess there was an agreement where it would state this, but nobody read these things. Scientologists always had to sign lots and lots and lots of papers. No one ever had time to read any of it, and they were not encouraged to do so in any way, shape, or form. So everybody
another very important point, because that's still occurring, where they sign these mega legal documents.
Right, and Scientologists trust the church. They feel like they have no reason to not trust the church. So because the church isn't going to do anything wrong, right? Well, one of my more technically savvy, meaning he knew something about computers, public, said to me he wouldn't install the program, and I asked him why not. He told me that it would install also this other program called Net Nanny, which would not allow him to go to certain websites, would track if, would track if, I guess, he was, say, in a chat room or something like that where someone mentioned a forbidden word or forbidden set of phrases or keywords. And I was shocked. I actually apologized to him because I had no idea that that was occurring. And I told him, well, I don't blame you. I wouldn't do it either. And at the time, there was so much going on and we were all very busy that I was able to just kind of there wasn't a lot of pressure coming to me to do it. So I just didn't. I just kind of dropped it. And I knew I couldn't. It wasn't one of those things that I could fight against. I knew I had to just quietly non-comply. But I was really upset about it, actually, because I considered myself very much in favor of free speech. And, I'd heard about by that time what, Helena Coburn had done about trying to delete the Usenet group. And I thought that was a completely wrong thing to do. I felt that everything that Scientology, the church, was doing and the OSA was doing to battle the internet was wrong and ham-fisted. I knew this at the time. I could see it but there was no fighting it because the powers that be were too, stubborn about this. I mean, the paranoia about negative press, I'll give you an example. It was astounding. The Wall Street Journal, right, is obviously a huge international paper, and they were so concerned about anything negative ever being in the Wall Street Journal that every DSA had to sort of monitor local media, right? So you had to read your local newspaper and monitor for any negative press. Well, there were certain publications that had to be checked every single day, and the Wall Street Journal was one of them. It was New York's job to do that. However, they found out that it got printed locally in my area, and I was able to get access to it before anybody else because because it's an international publication. They have more than one printing press, so it's all over the world.
Of course.
Right. And so I had to 5 nights a week, I think it came out, or 6 or whatever it was. I had to go to the printing press, and buy a copy off of the dock when they were loading it in at night, late at night, like 10 o'clock at night. I had to do this every night for a long time, months and months and months and months and months, and I had to report, and it was serious. This was something that was considered of utmost priority. How stupid is that? So that they would know a few hours in advance if there was anything negative.
In the Wall Street Journal?
In the Wall Street Journal, yeah.
Was there ever anything negative in the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, and it was always, that always really sucked when there was, just because it was more work. And it's just terrible to have to report something like that up because it just makes everybody's life hell, you see. It's not even that it's just another negative story and that we hate that it's negative. It was that it's that much more work that we're not going to really be able to do anything effective about.
Well, what kind of work did that mean for you? I mean, you reported up, but then what happens?
Well, I didn't have to do anything on the Wall Street Journal because that was New York's job. I would just hand it over to them and say, here you go, gift for you.
But locally,
But locally, I would have to try and get them to print positive press. It would go on my stats as a negative thing if there had been negative press, and it would stay on there until I was able to get something positive done. So I would have to write letters to the editor. I'd have to call and try and handle them on Scientology, get them, brought over to the side of thinking Scientology is great, get something positive printed about the church. And it was extremely hard to do that. So
knowing about that and that whole attitude and how paranoid the church was about its image, do you think that sort of thing is still going on, monitoring the internet now as well as print media?
It absolutely is, but I'm sure that they're completely overwhelmed. I'm so happy that I'm not a TSA right now. I can't even tell you. Oh, it was bad enough then with the little amount of bad press, and the internet was actually reasonably well contained at that point, all things considered. One of the things that really struck me when I sort of drifted away from the church was would hear mentions of Scientology and people talking about it, and it was always 100% negative. There were so many just common jokes in, I went to college and I did some classes, and not with, any irregularity. It was pretty common to hear somebody make some snide comment about Scientology in class, in the middle of class, and everybody would laugh, and it was just sort of like a known thing. So there's just no good press. Nobody I talked to would say anything good about Scientology, and it was really surprising how widespread it was. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned when we were, kind of prepping for this, that there was more to the CAN takedown, the Cult Awareness Network takedown, going back to that for a second here, than meets the eye.
Right, there was. Scientology was actually making concerted effort to redefine cults and sort of take back that word and lessen what cults were, and sort of give people a better impression of these, what they called new religions, what were termed new religions, and even to the point of trying to justify Jonestown and say it was really the FBI that did it, and come up with conspiracy theories about how it wasn't religion or cult that caused all these people to commit suicide. It was really some conspiracy by the FBI, and all of the stuff that was just completely speculative about giving cults a better name, basically. And Scientology would distance itself whenever there was a situation like what happened at Waco, and would try and blame, they actually tried to blame Cult Awareness Network for inciting the violence there. When Heaven's Gate happened, it was just complete distancing. Like, well, those people were obviously just crazy, and that has nothing to do with religions, and none of these other places that you deem cults are actually associated with any of this sort of stuff. So the whole plan was, when the takeover happened of the Cult Awareness Network, was to make it what the church deemed as a real source of information about new religions, where they would say good things about all these cults. And they, because one of the things that you had brought up in an interview with a former Jehovah's Witness was a good way to reach a cult member is to show them what other cults are doing, and and maybe hopefully they'll see the parallels to what's happening in their life.
That's right.
And what Scientology was trying to do was, and I probably still is trying to do, is to redefine what a cult is, and to say, well, none of that's really happening. These are all just lies, and all of these people are just apostates who are saying these bad things about these so-called cults. And that's a definite strategy.
Interesting. And also worthy of notice there is the redefinition of terms, which is a policy letter in the PR series, which of course you're familiar with, that I talk about in one of my other videos, is Hubbard wrote about. There's a policy letter called Propaganda by Redefinition of Terms. And he talks about how you take a word and you redefine it to mean what you want it to mean. And so we're going to take cult out of circulation, or we're going to redefine it to mean new religion, or the new religious movement. And this is not just with Scientology. I don't know that Scientology came up with this new religion movement idea, but they certainly tried to run with it with this Cult Awareness Network thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very definite strategy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've heard that certain groups that right now in present time who should be a bit more vocal about anti-cult activity are kind of falling into that trap a little bit, and acknowledging things like Scientology as giving it some validity or credibility as a new religion, when in fact it's nothing but a money-making scam and destructive cult. So, we have something to be vigilant about, which is why my ears pricked up when you talked about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Now, I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about with this was, you'd mentioned at one point you were working with the DSA San Francisco.
Yes. So what happened was my husband and I had gotten divorced, and I needed to start making some money. I had a child and I needed to support myself, and I was not making very much at all at the org. So I started working, part-time jobs for another Scientologist, and that started becoming something I needed to do more and more. And it basically slowly sort of drifted away from being the DSA Mountain View because I couldn't do my job. So lots of things occurred, and at one point I ended up, toward the end of my career in the Sea Org, so to speak, I ended up working in the DSA San Francisco office for a few months. And what happened there was I went and I was just trying to help him in whatever way I could. This is Jeff Quiros, who's been the DSA there for a really long time. And one of the things that he had was just huge amounts of papers that he needed to, I needed to go through and sort and file. And so it was this huge stack, ridiculously huge stack. And I started going through it and figuring out what was junk, what needed to be filed where. And I came across this knowledge report. Knowledge report. And it was about a public who had molested a 4-year-old girl who was the daughter of his girlfriend. And it was from some months prior, and I was obviously really freaked out about that. And
yes, obviously, and correctly so.
Yeah, and he was actually the pedophile was actually the brother of an OT7 who was a prominent member of the Scientology community, was opinion leader, and ran a school. She's deceased now. She had cancer and she died some years back. But they were trying to sort of handle this. The org was trying to handle this on the QT, and it was certainly, I wasn't involved in any of that because it was all sort of being done before I got there. But I was really upset because I found out that he was still being allowed to come into the org. He hadn't been turned into the police. None of that. The girl's father, who was divorced from the mother of the girl, was on staff. And I went and talked to him about it because I immediately I said, I don't care if I have authority or not. This guy needs to no longer be coming here, just at all. And so I issued an order, basically not allowing him to come into the org. It was it's called a potential trouble source declare.
Got it. Yeah, you labeled him as
I labeled him.
Criminal type.
Yeah, I labeled him as that. I wrote it, and you can't be really specific about that sort of stuff in issues, like in things that you write, because of legal things. So my hands were a little tied, but
you can't say he's a pedophilia. He can't come in the org. He's type B. Yeah. Stay away from this guy.
My first question was, why isn't he being turned into the police?
That's everybody's first question.
Right. Well, no, it wasn't. I was the only one asking that.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about.
Oh, that's everyone else's. Yeah, that's the people who were out of the bubble. Yeah.
Yes.
I went and talked to the father about it. He was obviously just enraged about the whole situation, and
so he didn't know about it.
Yeah, he did know about it, but he couldn't do it. His hands were completely tied. He was being told to completely stay out of it, which is outrageous. And he said he wanted to go to the police, and I told him that I think he should.
Well, good for you.
But he was being dealt with very closely on this and was basically prevented from doing that. And I guess the mother didn't want to go to the police. I never met her. I never had a conversation with her. I was only told she didn't want to go to the police. But I can only imagine that the same thing was occurring with her, that she was being pressured very heavily to not go to the police.
Who would have been doing that pressuring, and how would that have occurred?
That would have been the DSA, Jeff. It was the ED of the org was involved. His sister, the OT7, was definitely involved. She, in fact, was very upset when I issued the PTS declare and wanted it immediately removed.
What year was this?
This was, I believe it was early 2001. Yeah, it was early 2001.
Right. Do you remember who was the ED back then?
Yes, her name was Linda
Johnson.
Johnson. Yes, Linda Johnson.
So she was aware of this.
She was aware of it, yeah. A good chunk of the executives were. Not everybody. I don't think it went much further than that. My husband at the time, because I had gotten remarried, because as you do in the Sea Org, he was on staff in HCO at the time, and so he knew about it. And he had very long, protracted arguments with me about this because I was considered kind of a loose cannon about it because I made this OT7 opinion leader really upset because I issued a PTS declare on her brother. And yeah, it was nuts. It was nuts.
So
and
you become the bad guy because you're trying to, basically, by any standard outside of the Scientology crazy, you're trying to get ethics in.
Yeah, I'm trying to do something. This guy, I thought, should not be around the org. He should be turned into the police. And I was handled on it for hours and hours because I was so upset about the way this was being handled, and it was nothing I'd ever seen, and I just wouldn't budge, in my opinion. Unfortunately, also at that time, though, I was kind of on my way out of the Sea Org, and so I was in a tenuous position myself, and obviously, I wasn't, very. It was a really tumultuous time for me too. So it was pretty easy to make me bow to the will because I was, scum because I was leaving the Sea Org, you see, and I was this unethical, awful person for leaving the Sea Org, and I was told over and over again that going to the police was a bad idea because it would just make him worse, because if he went to jail, he would just get worse. And Scientology was the only thing that could actually handle him and stop him from reoffending. And I didn't believe that. It wasn't that I didn't, I was like, he should be in jail. And no, I was just silenced time and time again about it.
So really, the only thing you could have done, you were not going to get anybody else's cooperation on this. So short of literally walking into a police station or making phone calls, there wasn't. Right. You weren't convincing anybody else of your position.
Right. But I was told, like I said, the mother didn't want to go to the police. That was sort of a, that was a thing.
The mother and the father weren't going to press charges, that you had no case.
Right, and or
at least you felt you did, although...
I felt I had no leg to stand on, and I was very, like I said, I was in a very precarious position myself, so it was, and to this day, it's my biggest regret.
I totally understand.
And it haunts me. So
I totally understand that. So as far as you know, did anything ever get done on that?
I'll tell you what I know. So supposedly the guy's sister did his ethics handling and audited him and, quote unquote, handled him. And after I left, his PTS declare was removed and he was allowed to go back into the org and back on services. And I complained about that bitterly. I was again shut down. And a few years later, when the org was, on its drive to St. Hill size, to, expand, after the new org building had been opened, he was recruited for staff.
A pedophile.
And I, again, can't tell you how angry. It was one of the things that made me separate myself from the church, really. It was actually the main thing that made me just stop going to the org. No, I couldn't believe it. I absolutely couldn't believe it. And I complained bitterly. I was handled, not handled, but like I was dealt with to shut up and keep my mouth shut about it. And that's the saddest part, is that it was my husband who was doing the the dealing with me on it. So.
Right, because he was, and this is not the father of your child now. This is a different man who is still, by the way, a staff member at San Francisco, because you left and you guys got divorced, and we can talk about all that in a different time. But yeah, so you're literally in a world of the Twilight Zone where everyone is making you out to be the bad guy because you're trying to protect a 4-year-old girl.
And I'm trying to
and bring justice to a person who's molested her.
I was questioned about why I was so rabidly antagonistic to this guy, why I wanted to take him down, why I wanted to put him into the prison system that was just going to make him more criminal. That was what I was told and questioned about. Yeah. So, and at the time, because I had left the Sea Org and I had what's called a freeloader debt, I was treated as persona non grata by not the local staff because they didn't care, but by Sea Org members, and there were many Sea Org members always in San Francisco because of the new building and going St. Hills and whatnot.
Now this was the article this was the story that you ended up writing up for Render's blog, is that right?
It is, yeah. This is
okay, so this has been detailed.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It doesn't take away from the horror of it. I was just
but
to know that it's out there in writing as well.
I mean, I sort of felt like people would tell their leaving stories and all of this, and there's a lot of that done. But the thing that I wanted to tell was that story, and that was when everything rained down, and I got disconnected on Facebook by everyone, and my ex stopped talking to me and stuff. So. Yeah.
The irony is, that the church stands up on this moral pedestal and says, we are going to expose the crimes of the SPs and shine the light on the rats and get them, scurrying off into the corners and whatnot like cockroaches or rats or whatever analogy you want to make. And yet, that's them.
That's them. It's interesting because the policy letter, How to Handle Black Propaganda, describes this exactly, right? How to Handle Black Propaganda talks about whistleblowers, and it talks about how everyone has skeletons in their closet. And it specifically talks about affairs, right? Mm-hmm. People have affairs, things like this, but that these aren't the real crimes. These aren't the real things you're looking for. And those who are trying to silence whistleblowers are the ones who have the real crimes. Hubbard himself describes what the church is doing exactly. And it's pretty much word for word this scenario. Some of these people who have spoken out against the church who were in the Sea Org for decades, the only thing the church says is, oh, she's an adulteress.
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's right out of How to Handle Black Propaganda, right there.
When the new, well, you would know this, but when they opened the new Ideal Org, when they were moving from that crappy building in the Tenderloin where they used to be, the entire 4th floor of that building was the DSA's office.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
I mean, they had file cabinets and file cabinets. Like all the OSA West US staff had to go up there to deal with all that because they couldn't trust anybody else. And now we know why. This is the kind of thing that falls out of file cabinets.
Yeah.
Up there, and they had, and this is the DSA office in San Francisco. It's just an interesting point, but one I think is, who knows what else was in those file cabinets?
I know. This wasn't even in a file cabinet. This was sitting on a pile of papers on a desk. On a table.
No, I'm tracking. I'm just saying.
Agreed. But who knows what else is up there? It's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so having worked in OSA for years as a DSA at a local org level and knowing everything that you know about it now, what is your opinion of how the church actually operates versus, what's your takeaway from that versus how they say they operate?
Well, it's really interesting because I think that fair game, we always believed when I was a DSA that fair game was something that didn't exist, that it was not practiced, that it was old news. And now I can see very clearly that it absolutely is, that we did practice it, that it was used, that people who, it wasn't called fair game, the words weren't used, we were told fair game wasn't used, but the tactics, the way people were treated was absolutely fair game. It was absolutely as laid out in fair game. So
fair enough. And do you have any comment on how it is that you, or others, but from your own experience, what you just said is interesting from the point of view of thought and mind control to this degree, right? You're practicing fair game while you're literally not even saying that you're not practicing fair game, but you're even thinking that you're not practicing fair game.
Right, exactly. My only thought is, again, you're in a pressure cooker, you're kept so busy, and there's so much, like I said, the negative articles, the thing that bothered me more about them wasn't that they were negative, it was that, now here's another problem I have to deal with, you see. Can't these guys just shut up? It'll make my life so much easier. Honestly, that was the way it was, and that I think kept you and prevented you from really thinking about what was going on, and really thinking that, oh, hey, this stuff that I am doing really does kind of parallel fair game, and it really is this, this same thing.
Right.
You're just there's a huge cognitive dissonance, and you never get to think about it. And because there's a lot of us versus them, there's a lot of, they won't understand why this is important, and we do. So that plays into it quite a lot.
Exactly, and I do understand that a lot. So I totally track with that. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap up this segment of our interview now, but this has been fascinating. Your whole OSA experience here has been fascinating, and thank you very much for being willing to talk about all this stuff now and expose what I can only call the dark underbelly of Scientology, even at a local level.
Yeah.
And what actually goes on there. I think people are going to want to know about this. So thank you very much.
Sure.